the reason for this webinar, we recognize that these recent years that they've been trying for many people. And so you could be experiencing grief without even realizing that you are. And so that grief can result in you feeling hopeless, and you feeling lost, or in you feeling this sadness that just doesn't seem like it'll go away. And so we are here at TimeWise, we're your financial advisors, but we recognize that wealth is no good to you if you're not healthy enough or happy enough to truly enjoy it. And so we are so excited to offer this webinar to you as a resource and hopefully as a help to you. Janice Jernigan, she is our guest speaker, and she experienced personally the toll that unresolved grief can have on your life. And she decided to get honest with herself, get honest with other people, and she dug deep to experience the healing that she really, truly needed. And so she's going to talk more about that. She also wrote a book. It is called Opening Up to Grief. And so we are extremely excited to have her here. She actually is a connection through Sherry. And so we thought it'd be fun if they just took a little bit of time just to, kind of share how they met each other, how they know each other before Janice gets started. So Sherry.
Thank you. Hi, Janice. It has been so fun to reconnect with Janice. We both had former lives at a company and worked together on various projects, probably over a time span of 10 years. And our paths went different ways, and I left the company and she did some time later, and we reconnected literally on LinkedIn and I loved it. And I was especially excited because she was promoting her book that she recently written. And so I reached out to her, and we've been sharing texts and emails. And here we are today. We had some meetings about just how valuable her experiences has been. We wanted to bring it into TimeWise, and it's been a wonderful process. And I'm happy to introduce you to Janice.
Yes.
Thank you,
Awesome.
Kimani. I will join you all online.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Sherry.
you.
Bye. All right. So, Janice, you can go ahead and take it from here.
All right. Well, thank you, Kimani and Sherry, for that wonderful introduction. In thinking about preparing for this, I thought, what if we were to willingly embrace our grief and feel a greater sense of connection to the people, places, and things that we care about? I happen to know this is possible because it is part of my own life's journey. I have been living with grief for almost half a century. And that sounds like a very long time, and it is. It's a long time to be, living with grief. And for the first 30 years of my life, grief was a silent companion. It was rarely, if ever, acknowledged by myself or by those around me. And in the last 20 years, I've been doing what I call grieving well. And I'll talk about what that means in a moment. But by grieving well, I have found a deeper love for myself, for nature, and for those around me, other folks in my life and beyond. And through grieving well, I have developed a deeper love also for the losses that I've had in my life. I've learned to embrace life rather than going through the motions like I was before I started grieving well. And I smile a lot more now. So I like to tell people I do smile a lot, and it took a lot of grieving to get to that point where I could genuinely smile. I mean, we all know about the smiles we paint on our faces. And I did that for many years. But, what I hope to help all of us is get to a place where we are genuinely smiling more often. Because grieving well, for me, it has been life-changing. Not an understatement or overstatement to say it's life-changing. So why I'm here, sharing my story, my sister, who her name was Julie, she died when I was 3 years old. She had leukemia and she died at the age of 7. And that's where it took me decades before I actually, started truly grieving for that loss. But I want to share my story because I want the same for you as far as grieving well, minus the delay of 30 years to really embrace grief. I believe that by hearing each other's stories, we can learn, heal, and grow. And also, it reminds us we're not alone. And that's part of what I feel like my mission in life is. Grief and loss and grief found me at a very young age because I'm still relatively young. And yet I know that even after, in my case, 47 years from losing my sister, I know that grief is still a part of my life. And that's not a bad thing. So, as I think about grieving well, I've given a lot of thought to this over the years, and my own definition of what it means to grieve well is granting ourselves the grace and space to fully feel and process our losses. Granting ourselves the grace and space to fully feel and process our losses. It sounds simple enough, right? And yet often it doesn't happen. So while every one of our loss and losses is uniquely personal, and we all grieve differently, there are 2 big hurdles that tend to get in the way of grieving well. And that's where I plan to focus our time today. So the first hurdle is around not recognizing a loss as a loss. And then the second one is around harmful beliefs. So let's explore both of these. If we start with first, not recognizing a loss as a loss. To level set, I believe we experience loss anytime our reality falls short of what we hope, expect, or dream. So this could certainly be death, the death of a spouse or parents, death of a child or other relative, or the death of a sibling, as in my case. It can also be the end of a relationship, whether it's through divorce or losing connection with someone or losing a career, the end of a career. Loss can come from a devastating diagnosis. It can come from, as Kimani alluded to, like the pandemic. That's a loss. And it can also come through catastrophic front page news, like natural disasters or the mass shootings that we hear about through the news. And these losses that I've just mentioned, each one of them can bring on or ignite a cascade of secondary losses. And I think of secondary losses as chain reactions to our loss. So for instance, the death of a loved one could result in the loss of how we set the table. We set the table for one less person when we sit down for dinner. We could become less financially stable because perhaps the provider is no longer able to provide. We could lose a part of our identity. When you think of ending our career, our identity, there may be things through our health issues, we may not be able to physically do what we once did. That is a loss. when we think back to the pandemic, during the height of that, we've lost closeness and physical touch. So many celebrations and vacations were canceled. That is a loss. And then, of course, with the front page news, in many cases, our sense of safety is being disturbed. We no longer feel safe, say at home or work or school or the grocery store. So for me, the loss of my older sister, Julie, had quite a few secondary losses. And these were my everyday realities. So things like we didn't have family photos hanging on the wall because it was too painful to have photos with my sister to see that every day, but it was also too painful to have photos without her in them. So that was a secondary loss. Also, holidays, they became sad reminders instead of joyous occasions. And I'm sure many of you can relate to that. I also lost my built-in playmate, as a 3-year-old, the person who was always there, my sleeping buddy. So those were losses as well. So there are so many losses and secondary losses in our lives. And we often think about loss as something that, that it's brought about by horrendous negative things. And while that's true, it can also, we can experience loss even when something in our life changes, even happy things, like we're moving to a new house, or we're getting married, or welcoming a baby to our lives, or perhaps a child is leaving home. Maybe it's exciting that they're leaving home. At the same time, we're leaving something or someone behind with our losses. So I've talked a lot about different losses, and in the hopes of helping us recognize the losses in our lives. Of course, a lot of losses are ever present. We can't not remember them or think of them. So think for a moment, just consider a loss that is top of mind for you right now. And as we talk about the second hurdle, it will be helpful to be thinking about your personal loss. It may actually bring this next hurdle to life, make it a little more real and realistic for you. So think about a loss that is top of mind. Because like I say, the first hurdle is recognizing our loss as a loss. The second hurdle on the path to grieving well is harmful beliefs. These can be limiting beliefs. At times they're hidden. They also can be so ingrained in our lives that they feel like they're a fact. They're not a belief. They're just a fact. So when I think about our difficult beliefs or harmful beliefs, one that comes to mind is time heals all wounds. I'm sure if I could see all of you and I asked you to raise your hand to see if you had ever experienced that, I'm sure some folks would raise their hand. That's a harmful belief. Also, things like you need to get over it and move on. Or you need to be strong. And often being strong, the underlying belief is you need to keep your feelings to yourself. It's been a week since your loss and you really need to move on. You need to be strong. Those bad emotions, by the way, that's a belief, bad emotions like anger, fear, and sadness, those are all harmful, hurtful beliefs. And in my case, when I was faced with the common question growing up of, do you have any siblings? People typically responded when I told them my shortened story about losing my sister. They often responded and said, that must have been hard on your parents. And I interpreted that as, wow, well, it must not have been hard on me because you're talking about my parents. So I formed that belief based on what people said. Another thing people often said since I was 3 years old when my sister died was, at least you were too young to be impacted. Thank goodness you were too young to be impacted. I heard these things so often. I created my own tailor-made, what I didn't know at the time, but they were harmful beliefs. I started using a canned response when someone said, do you have any siblings? And I would quickly say, well, I grew up as an only child. That was a harmful belief. So what makes these beliefs so harmful? They minimize our loss. They cause us to question our own right to grieve. And they help us get stuck. They cause us to get stuck and unable to move forward in our grief. So let me shed some light on the truth of these harmful beliefs. The passage of time itself does not heal all wounds. Granting ourselves the grace and space to fully feel and process our losses, that's what helps us heal. And we do not get over our losses or those we love. We go through grief, and it becomes integrated into who we are. And the belief of you need to be strong. To be strong is giving our feelings a productive way to be expressed. And our emotions, they wish to be acknowledged, and they really are intended to flow through us, not to get stuck. And when we really look at our emotions, we can actually leverage them to be pathways to greater awareness. If we're feeling anger, for instance, what is making me angry? Is it really the person that just cut me off in traffic? Or is it something else? What's underneath my anger? For instance, for me, when I talked about my beliefs, my sister's death, whereas people said, that was hard on your parents. That was true. It was very hard on my parents, and it was hard on me. Comparison can often be the thief of grief. When we are in that mode of thinking about whose loss is greater, like in my case, I was saying, oh, it must be harder to lose a child than it is a sibling. Or you may have heard people say, wow, it's harder to lose, for someone to lose their parent as a child than it is to lose a parent when you're an adult. When we get in that place of determining whose loss is less than or greater than, it diverts focus away from our grief. So it can be harmful when we compare our grief. And then also, I talked earlier about folks would say I was too young to be impacted. That was not true. I was not too young to be impacted. I was too young, perhaps, to articulate my grief, but it didn't mean that I didn't sense and suffer the loss. And my own made up harmful belief unintentionally about saying I grew up as an only child. The truth is I grew up as a surviving sibling, and that is a very different experience than being an only child. So consider the loss that I asked you to think about earlier, the loss that is top of mind for you. And I have a few questions just for you to be thinking about, or we can provide these afterwards if you like. But just to really help you think about what kind of bring this, make it a bit more personal for you, what we've just talked about. So think about what belief statements you're hearing from others, whether it's time heals all wounds or something else. What have you heard from others, but also what beliefs have you assumed as your own? I shared examples of beliefs I had come up with on my own based on what I saw and what those around me said. And then think about, how are these beliefs hurting or helping you to grieve? So the three questions are really the belief statements you're hearing from others, the beliefs you've assumed as your own, and then how are those beliefs serving you, or are they serving you in your grief? So sometimes we may not even realize how our beliefs are impacting us. So I wanted to share some signs that we may be stuck in our grief or have some unresolved grief. Another one that Kimani alluded to earlier is if we're crying or feeling sadness, and we may not necessarily know why. We may not be able to, that may not be on the surface. That could be a sign that we're stuck. Getting angry or overreacting to everyday situations. Like I was talking about earlier, getting mad at a driver, on the road. Having difficulty making decisions, even more so than perhaps we normally do. Aiming to numb the pain in some way, somehow distracting ourselves. It could be from overworking, it could be from shopping or staying busy. We may turn to alcohol or even focusing so much on helping others that it distracts us and keeps us from being present in our own grief. Those can be signs. Of course, there's a plethora of other reasons why we may do some of these things, but a lot of times they are signs of grief. And another one, unexplained pain. So our body remembers things that we may not remember. And it speaks to us through pain. That's how, in a lot of ways, that's how it gets our attention. So for me, I could relate to a lot of these signs of being stuck in my grief, especially before I learned how to grieve well. I was not in tune to my grief. I knew I had lost a sister. I'd always known that, but I was not in tune to my grief until my body started screaming at me in pain. There was a time in my early 30s when if you met me then, it was as if I was able to exist like an 80-year-old woman. I was literally crawling up the stairs to my bedroom in the house where I lived at the time. I was barely making it through a work day, being able to be present. And I was just in such pain that the weekends were relegated to the couch. And while that sounds great to be on the couch for a weekend, when it's weekend after weekend, that's all I felt like doing. I had such pain. And so a big part of my story with that is I was looking for solutions. And so I went to doctor after doctor. I tried various medications, various natural healing remedies. I wanted to get better. That became my full-time job almost. And I was diagnosed with a plethora of ailments. What they had in common is that they were very hard to pinpoint, and they didn't have a known cure. And so after nearly 2 years of my debilitating pain, I mean, it was the center of my life. I had two separate specialists that said to me, you will have this pain for the rest of your life. And as I mentioned, I was in my early 30s. That's a hard thing to hear. And so I knew that if that were true, and I had no reason not to believe it was true, I knew that I would need emotional support to help come to terms with, having this pain the rest of my life. And so I sought professional help. I found a therapist, and in my first conversation with her, my first meeting, she heard my story. She heard the way I talked about my sister. I was very robotic in the way I talked about, I would often say I grew up as an only child. I had a sister who was 7 who died from leukemia, and I was 3. And then I would move on with my story. And she said, I can't promise you anything, but I believe you were suffering from stuck grief. And she was right. I didn't know whether to believe that at the time, but she represented hope. And so I was willing to do the grief work at that time. And she supported me in recognizing my sister's death as my own, a loss for me. She helped me to realize that I had these harmful beliefs. I had always thought they were facts. And for the first time in my life, I was able to own my sister's death, the loss of my sister, as my own loss. And I cried as if my sister had just died, even though at that time it was over 30 years later. My grief was so fresh and raw. I mean, I wept, I sobbed, I wailed, I made sounds that, I'm sure we can all relate, but it was so fresh for me. And when you think about it, I had decades of grief that was waiting to be released. And my story has a wonderful, wonderful journey to it, because within 6 months of beginning my journey of grieving well, I no longer had any physical pain. It's just powerful. And all these years later, I am still learning and healing and growing from my grief. So I cannot overemphasize the importance of talking about your grief. Whether you find a therapist like I did, whether you find a grief coach, or perhaps you have a really good, caring, and compassionate friend, someone who can truly listen and hold space for you and your grief, someone who can offer support for you without trying to fix you. Sometimes it's very hard for those close to us to see us in pain. And so it's helpful to get someone who is not as tied to our loss to help, because I can tell you your loss is real and your feelings matter. So being able to talk about those and be seen and acknowledged for your grief is powerful and so important for your healing journey. I will tell you, as we all unfortunately know too well, loss happens to all of us. And grieving well is a practical and beneficial life skill. And it begins with recognizing our losses and challenging our harmful beliefs about grief. So grieving well, for me, I believe it's a lifelong journey. I am still granting myself the grace and space to fully feel and process my losses. And I can tell you personally, it's opened my heart up in ways I never thought possible. It's expanded my capacity for empathy for others as well as for myself. And I now have deeper connections with folks. I have personal insights that help me understand more about who I am and who I'm becoming. And all of that brings healing to my heart. And I want the same for you. I genuinely want that for you. I know how life-changing it can be. And so that's why I wrote my story. I wrote my book, and it's about my path through loss and love to be able to find hope and healing. And so my book, and you can see it, it's what's been behind me all this time as well. But in writing it, I was aiming to create a safe and sacred space for readers, folks, to be able to spark a dialogue about grief. And it includes a resource guide at the back that's great for surviving siblings, those who care for them, as well as anyone who is suffering from grief or stuck grief. So I wrote the book because I want to evoke a feeling of hope for people going through grief. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I know I've shared a lot with you, and I want to thank Deanna for having the vision for this Meaningful Life program, or Meaningful Living, and to Sherry for thinking of me for this opportunity, and to Kimani for being such a wonderful partner in making this happen. And I'd also like to thank each one of you for being willing to hear my story and for opening up to grief. Grieving well is the greatest gift you can give yourself and those you hold dear.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janice, for sharing your story. It definitely resonates in, thinking that grief and unresolved grief, it can manifest itself in, you feeling mentally like there's a heaviness there, but then also, a physical heaviness, which I think showed itself in the pain that you were experiencing in your own body. And that's pain that I think you mentioned that you stopped dealing with 6 months after you began talking about. After you began talking about and dealing with your grief. And so I think that's just such a powerful story and a powerful testimony. And so it seems like that for all of us, if you think that you may be experiencing grief in any way, like a first step, it sounds like, is to open up and talk about it. And you had the opportunity to talk to a therapist who is a great resource, but there also are probably friends, family members who are close to you, who care and who would love to listen to what it is that you're experiencing and what you're going through. So I did want to open up this time for questions. If anyone has any questions, please, you can unmute yourself and you can ask. And then I have a couple of questions as well. So we'll see if anybody wants to unmute themselves first and ask anything.
Hey there. So I don't have a question, Janice. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think that some of the notes that I had taken were more in line with, time heals all wounds. And it was funny, I was just reading an article last night and I was talking about, have you heard the phrase to pick a better feeling thought, and that's not actually good for you? And I was kind of taken back, like, well, why wouldn't that be good? And it's because, similar to what you were saying, it sounds like if we're not really sitting with our emotions, whether that's anger or grief or sadness, that could lead to, it could just continue to manifest itself and grow. And so and then I was thinking, and the lady was actually asking some open-ended questions, and I was thinking, well, then it's just got to be time. Time must heal all wounds. And so it's then, again, it's funny to hear you saying no and not that, and no and not that. So, I guess I feel like granting ourselves space and time could be easier said than done. And so I guess I do have a question. How do you suggest, so for instance, for me, I'm so busy, and I think my go-to is just making myself busier to numb out some feelings that I may have. So how do you suggest granting that time and space?
That's a great question. And I definitely don't profess to be an expert there, because I am someone who loves to be busy and likes to stay busy. What helped me is spending time in nature without my phone, just spending time walking around, whether it's a trail or in my backyard or whatever it is, to have silence and to be okay with whatever comes up. Before I started grieving well, whenever I had quiet, thoughts of sadness and grief and things like that would come up. And so I thought, oh, I need to do laundry, or I need to do something. So yes, for me, it was spending time in nature. And another thing that has helped me is to have, whether it's a chunk of time each week, a day or an hour or 10 minutes, to not have anything planned or scheduled. So it's building space into your day or your week to be able to just feel whatever you need to feel.
I love that. So have time to plan to not plan.
Exactly.
That works well for me.
Exactly.
As long as I can have a plan.
Yes,
not plan.
for sure. And check in with yourself,
Yeah.
maybe at towards the end or even beginning of the 10 minutes or an hour, ask yourself, okay, what's the biggest feeling that I'm feeling right now? Let me put that into, name it. And because that's helpful. Like sometimes I'll feel like, wow, my biggest feeling right now, I'm angry, but what am I angry about? And so it's digging into those things.
Yeah.
But it takes space to be able to do that. So nature is my biggest suggestion on at least what's helped me.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that was such a great point, Janice, and just taking some time to be by yourself and actually get quiet, because you're really able to, judge your condition and see how you're doing personally when you take that time to be silent, because that's when, certain thoughts start creeping up and things like that. And so if those thoughts are there, if they're present, it's not that they went away just because you were busy. They were just waiting until you were silent to, show their ugly head. And so if you have, certain thoughts that sneak up on you when you're quiet and you feel like, oh, if I'm busy, then they'll just go away. They don't truly go away until you deal with why they're there in the first place.
Yes. Kimani, I'm so glad you said that, because let me tell you something that my therapist said, this has been over 20 years now, that stuck with me. It's no one gets a pass on grief. And at the time, it was not even a 3-year-old, but it's so true. So no one gets a pass on grief. So that's another thing to remember, that, we don't get to go around it or get a pass on it, no matter what. Doesn't matter if we, try to say, well, we didn't have a good relationship, so I don't have any grief. Well, no one gets a pass on grief.
And something comforting in that.
A broken record with grief.
Yes.
No one gets a pass on grief.
No, but it's good, because something comforting in that is that knowing like you are not alone. You're not the only one who has experienced grief, is experiencing grief, will experience grief, or experiences the effects of it. You're not alone. So don't feel like you have to hide. Just be willing, and open to sharing, because there's someone else who's experienced something similar to you as well. And so we do have some men who are on the line. And so I wanted to talk about toxic masculinity, because men oftentimes they feel like they need to suppress their emotions in order to feel strong. And I know your husband, you'd mentioned yesterday when we were talking, you'd mentioned that he experienced the loss of his mother when he was young. Did he feel like, he had to fight through feelings of he needs to suppress that because he's a man? And how did he go about being able to grieve properly?
Yes. And think about all the beliefs around what you just said. You need to be a big boy. You need to not cry. Boys don't cry. Men don't cry. Those types of things. Those are beliefs that are out there and they're not serving us very well. Everyone processes grief differently. And he was 10 years old when his mother passed away. And his dad remarried quickly and had a whole nother family as well. So think about all the losses involved with that. So I also believe that when one person in your family goes to therapy, depending on who that person is, likely your whole family is in therapy, even if they never go to see the therapist. So as I was working through my grief, it was a gift that I gave my husband as well, because he had grief as well. It wasn't near as hidden as mine, but he had it as well. And there was a lot of unresolved grief that he had too, he and I, it brought us closer together too, to be able to process our grief with each other and have open dialogue about it. And he started talking to his sister about it, even years later, and it helped her heal. And so it really goes back to talking about it. And with the, toxic masculinity that you talked about, it's really finding the people that are strong enough to create a safe space for you. So it's, in a lot of ways, I think about, we share our story with the people who have earned the right to hear our story.
Yeah.
There are some people who, if they are like, you've got to be a man, you can't cry. Well, they are not someone who has earned the right to hear your story.
Absolutely.
So I would focus on the people who have and talk with them. There are a lot of people out there who are open. And so it's just a matter of finding them.
Yes. Thank you. I think that's such great advice to definitely, choose carefully who you're going to share your story with and open up to, as well as, choose the people that you surround yourself with carefully, because if there are people who, you feel like you can't be open or honest with about whatever it is that you may be going through, then, maybe it'll be a good time to start exploring and seeing, if there are other friendships that you could cultivate and that you could find, so that you can be, a healthier person all around.
Yes. And there are a lot of support groups out there as well.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
that wasn't the route that I took. I needed, just personally, I'm more of an introvert. And so I wanted the one-on-one conversation, but I know a lot of people who have gone the route of support groups, and that has really been helpful as well.
Yes. Thank you so much, Janice. If there are no other questions that we have, it is about 11:50. So thank you so much. We appreciate your time. We appreciate you sharing your story and opening up to us. And I hope that this leaves you all with a deeper desire just to be honest with not only yourself, but with those around you, so that you can start walking in the healing that you need. So thank you. Thank you so much, Janice. We appreciate it. And you guys all have a good rest of your day. Bye.